Okay, so let's move on, and I would like to introduce our speakers. We have Charlotte McGinnis, who is design system product manager slash lead, and then we also have Taylor Cashton, who is a design systems manager at the Mayo Clinic, and I'm Michelle Chin, a design advocate at Zero Height. All right. So, feel free for the first half, we'll just have a discussion. And then if you have questions, feel free to add that in the chat. The second half of the webinar, we will pick questions from the audience and have Charlotte and Taylor answer them. All right. So before we officially jump in, Charlotte and Taylor, would you like to give a quick intro about your design system experience, what you currently do, and a fun fact about yourself? Charlotte, would you like to start?
Sure. Hey everyone, nice to see you all. My name's Charlotte. I've been working in the design system world, I guess, as a PM for the last 5 years, most specifically in the HR industry. So I've had a bit of a breadth of experience. I've been involved in merging design systems, deprecating design systems, etc. And yeah, most recently my last role was at Personio, which is a HR software platform. And a fun fact, I have done 2 skydives in my life when I lived in Australia, and it was amazing, and I would certainly do one again tomorrow if I could. Taylor, over to
Wow.
you.
Skydiving's awesome. That terrifies the hell out of me.
Same.
I'm Taylor. Nice to see everybody and hang out with all of you. Design systems background. So I've been in the design system space for about the same time as Charlotte, about 5 years. A little bit in fintech, a little bit in the startup world, and now in the healthcare space. So it's been a nice journey of a lot of that kind of deprecation stuff, of merging, of net new, of what do we do with the current, of what. So it's been a fun couple of years. And fun fact about myself, my first design job was allegedly photoshopping my friends' report cards for them in high school so that they wouldn't get grounded.
And look where it took you.
And now we're here, right?
That's awesome. All right. So, wanted to kick things off with just a little bit of context for the people attending. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the design system teams you've worked on and kind of like evolution of like where your design system team has or your design system has come. Taylor, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah. So the teams I've worked on, I think that are relatively sized to the organization, right? So when I was at Fidelity, for example, we had 3 designers, 4 engineers, a PO, and a Scrum Master. That was kind of the largest team I was on. When I worked at Hologram, the IoT startup, it was just myself and engineering lead. So it was a lot of we did the bulk of all the different tasks because the company was smaller. And then now at the Mayo Clinic, the current team is 3 designers, 2 engineers, and then myself, kind of serving a hybrid manager, PM, strategy kind of amalgamous role. And on occasion, we have people pop in on all those companies and roles for content and research, but more in like a cyclical fashion, not in a dedicated kind of core team situation.
Yeah, nice. And for me, very similar actually. So when I first started off in design systems, there was literally, I think, 3 of us, myself, 1 designer and 1 engineer, the typical kind of what are we doing and how are we going to approach this? Most recently, and also in the previous role, I think the ratio was around about 2 or 3 designers to kind of around 6 or 7 engineers. So I have worked on quite kind of big teams, usually with an engineering lead, myself, and then obviously partnering with the likes of kind of content design and research as well, kind of as we needed them. But yeah, in all of the roles that I've worked on, I've been lucky enough to work in roles where we have a kind of a dedicated design system team that is kind of sitting within kind of the platform experience space for the roles that I've worked in.
Very nice. Yeah. So, Taylor, why don't you tell us a little bit about your design system evolution, um, if you have any thoughts on that?
Sure, yeah. So each of the orgs I've been at have had kind of a different starting point. So like Fidelity, for example, it was kind of an organic thing that each of the business units kind of had going. They were doing their best to spin up what they thought was right for them, sort of thing. And there was an acknowledgement that over time, hey, maybe it makes sense to like centralize this or create some sort of core group that at least gives some beginnings. So there's not so much difference of different, products or business units in an attempt to make at the time, the Fidelity brand feel like one brand across all the different many products that are acquired and spun up over time. So the normal, enterprise selling point. And that one was, multi systems kind of merging into one, and then evolutions of that one to then serve kind of bigger. At the startup, it was more of in an attempt to prepare for scale. So they knew they were going to grow very quickly. Market changed that, of course, but so we were doing stuff early and often, so that as the company scaled, we were ready for that, and it wasn't kind of an afterthought situation. So that was a bit more of a preemptive kind of system in many ways. And Mayo's kind of on the other side. So they tried this system-y thing a few times, sometimes with agency help, sometimes with pocket teams. And they recognized over time that while all that work was helpful to getting everything inched a little closer, that it was time to kind of have a centralized, dedicated group that would be there for like the long term to kind of maintain all those different places, merge what needs merging, divide what needs dividing, and then have a point group to be able to maintain those resources, keep them up to date, provide support. So that seems to be the kind of the natural curve, at least when I'm talking to others, that they kind of eventually hit, is like, we can do this, all over the place for a certain amount of time, but at some point we need at least a person or two, right, to start like giving this a direction or maintaining a vision.
Yeah, for sure. At some point, you need to grow up. Charlotte, I guess, how has your experience been when design systems you've worked on have evolved? Is it similar or different?
Yeah, it's similar in the fact, like when I worked for the kind of the small team that I mentioned before, it was literally just a huge mess. And I think the main reason of bringing someone in like myself was to kind of just have that product aspect, and to kind of figure out what we were going to prioritize, figure out a roadmap for the first time kind of ever, and just almost like start from the foundations with things like tokenizing and creating kind of docs that actually made sense for everyone, and really kind of starting from the ground up. And also kind of over time, so over the 3 years that I was in that role, we kind of merged with another company, and they already had a design system, which was super fun. So we eventually had to kind of merge them together, deprecate one of the old ones, move to more of a kind of a web component technical stack, which was really interesting, and kind of like porting them over like kind of one by one essentially, which was a bit of a long haul, but we did end up pulling it off in the end. And that was really great experience. And then in my most recent role, it was similar. I mean, there was definitely a product and just quite a great design system that was already there, but I was kind of brought in also to kind of be involved in things like rebrands, and really focusing on like the impact and the adoption of using the design system, and kind of listening to customers, trying to improve efficiencies, really trying to get to grips with them understanding the real customer problems and how the design system could solve some of those problems. So we did manage to kind of pull that off with a rebrand, and tracking. I know we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that was really lovely to see as well. As we were starting to ship things, we could actually physically see teams picking up those components and them having a great impact, and that was quite rewarding for the team as well. So
Yeah,
yeah.
for sure. I think, that's the thing, is like there's so much work involved in a design system, and it can take a while for it to show up in product, but when it does, it feels very rewarding. I wanted to talk a little bit more about your role, Charlotte, as a product manager, because not a lot of design system teams, in conversations I've had and people I've worked with, have a product manager. So for people who might be unfamiliar with the product manager role on a design system team, can you add a little clarity kind of around like what your roles and responsibilities are, and how that might be unique and helpful to a design system team?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've had this question a few times, because I think doesn't really sit in the kind of the traditional realm of product management, where you kind of have a product area and all the different features, etc. So the roles that I've been in as a design system PM have been similar, in the fact that you have to have a roadmap, and prioritizing the right types of things, understanding the types of impact that you're going to have. But most importantly, because being within a platform team, you're kind of exposed and chatting to way more people than you probably would if you were in your own product realm, right? So you really have to listen and understand the customers constantly, because engineers and designers are essentially the customer, and the product is the documentation, right? So you have to ensure that that's a real nice fit throughout the role, and to ensure that that's always kind of hitting the mark on a constant basis. And the stakeholder management, like really just understanding the users and the products that they're trying to build, and how we can partner and make that a nice kind of harmonious process, and a positive one as well, that's actually going to save the users time. and kind of, yeah, the same types of things with regards to like listening to users and all of that type of stuff. But I do think it's kind of more at the core of the business because of the amount of touch points that this role has. You really have to kind of be a very big advocate for design systems and really be, waving the flag for why, the design system is important. And sometimes that doesn't, you go into organizations and they don't really get it. They're a little bit like, what is this thing of, they might be new to design systems. They're not really sure how they work. So there's definitely a big education piece there as well to kind of almost really hammer home the importance of having a design system and why our team exists and how it's going to benefit all the other product teams in the long run. So yeah, similar and different in those different ways. But yeah, it's the design system space is an awesome space to be in, and yeah, I love doing what I do.
Yeah. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. And Taylor, as a design manager, I assume maybe you probably have some similar responsibilities, but how is your role different than other design manager roles?
Yeah, I think it's so to be blatantly clear, I kind of made my title. So inside of our like HR, process with the work, I'm considered a lead product designer, but I'm not doing IC work. It's not kind of my realm. So it caused a little bit of confusion internally. I'm like, well, who's the person kind of helping that, managing that team or handling that roadmap or whatever. And as the system has changed, I just adopted the design system manager title for clarity because that's more like what I'm doing. It's more akin to that. So compared to like I guess a traditional design manager role, I think the difference might be in that where a lot of what Charlotte was talking about, like helping that like roadmap stuff and doing more product kind of thinking and that more like system connection stuff between people that maybe some design manager roles are more focused on just the ICs or the projects they're on. My role takes that other strategy, almost product-esque lens as well. So it's I have a few direct reports. I'm helping with the strategy and kind of amalgamation of how we build things, and then also doing that roadmappy advocate stuff outside. So it's kind of a weird hybrid chaos to a certain extent. And I think kind of what Charlotte was alluding to is like some of this stuff is so different at every org, right? Number one. Number two, the space is kind of new and figuring out like how this role or a role plays a role, in getting that to the next level. So it's a messy middle, but it's I think it's an opportunity to really help mold what that looks like, right? And then I like that chaos kind of inside, so it works out for me.
Yeah, I feel like, yeah, if you like chaos, then you probably like design systems. But design systems are supposed to reduce the chaos, ironically.
In due
Let's jump.
time, right?
Yeah, exactly. Let's jump into the report. Um, okay, so this is a chart from the report where overall most companies have 2 to 3 active contributors for their design system. And from your experience, I'd love to hear like what are some signals where an organization might need more contributors, and when it comes to like processes and governance, what should teams think about when they increase the number of contributors? I don't know if Charlotte or Taylor, you have any thoughts?
I can jump in on this one if you like. So yes, this is an interesting one because in the roles that I've been, we've obviously had those centralized dedicated teams where the engineers and designers are constantly contributing to the design system. But I think when you start to think about other product teams and when they start to contribute, I can talk a little bit about that, and then I'll touch on your question as well. So I think the most important thing is kind of when you open up your contributions to the design system, it's really about understanding, what are they trying to achieve in this contribution, also educating them on the best practices as well, because I think what's really important is that you don't want to bloat the design system, right? Like everyone loves it when they can get in there and add things and all of that type of stuff, but there has to come a certain point where you've kind of got to push back a little bit and say, is this contribution going to be valuable? Is it going to have impact in the long term? And sometimes actually say no to some of those contributions as well. Some of the processes that we had in place where we had our doc site, we essentially had kind of a separate area where teams could suggest a contribution and it would go through to a different board, and then we would kind of like review them one-on-one and just see like, okay, does this make sense? Usually there's some Figma files attached to it. We would kind of discuss that with the designer, and then it would be up to us as to whether or not we would build it or another team would build it. We kind of had those open collaborative discussions, and I think that's a really important thing, is collaboration. Like it's so vital when you're having contributions to bring everyone together and ensure that we're actually singing from the same hymn sheet, right? We don't want to have inconsistencies because otherwise that's just going to immediately affect the product. And I think to your other question around, keeping an eye out for things. I think if you start to spot a lot of inconsistencies and just like continuous custom code for the same types of things, I think that probably would warrant, okay, let's have a bit of a rethink, and let's understand if we can put some processes in place to just make it quite simple, but also, you know, improve the product and add to that consistent, smooth feeling in the product. So yeah, they're my few thoughts on it. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, Taylor.
Yeah, I think you covered the pushback piece kind of at the top, and I was just like nodding along because like that's the essential thing, and I think helping define, and I don't mean that in like a, you know, it should always be protected, pushback on all things that are contribution, but I think it's helpful to define the roles a little bit more, right, in that sense. So like I don't consider any dedicated resources or like allocated design system team members as contributors. I consider them maintainers, right? That's a separate bucket to me, and that the reason I kind of draw that line is I think oftentimes, especially you know when we're only looking at like the deliverables, right? The UI kit or the code repo or the documentation side. I think it tends to knock out a bunch of things that would and should be considered contributions, right? Like I think again we tend to think, oh, they built a feature or they helped build a component, but giving feedback is a contribution. Helping advance a piece of documentation is a contribution. Making a feature request is a contribution. So I think the way that gets shaped up can differ at every organization, right? You're gonna have teams that want to be involved. There's gonna be teams that just want to get a thing and don't have to think about it. There's gonna be people that want to be active and just see, you know, how the sausage is made, so to speak. But the way I kind of like to think about it is the wider you can consider what a contribution is, the more involved your consumers and your community is going to want to be, because they can go, oh, I can contribute by just giving you really good, helpful feedback. It doesn't have to be this massive undertaking of building an object, right? But I think the hard part that often gets lost in the sauce there is like that kind of needs the core team to define types of contribution, right? And the level of intricacy or effort, right, involved with that. Like a consuming team can absolutely build a component on their own and try to contribute it back, but like they don't get the context of all the decisions that were made at the system level to help that. So they have to be open to adjustment, right? Or it taking longer than they might. But you know, at larger orgs, like I'll give an example of Fidelity, we had folks that didn't have the bandwidth to like build a thing, but they are really passionate about how a thing looked or behaved afterwards. So instead of them contributing the actual, you know, object, they instead became like a consultant, right? We would check in with them often, like, hey, is this kind of where your head was going? Here's the limitations on why this, you know, yada yada yada. And that became a form of contribution or collaboration in that regard. And I think the hard thing here is just remembering like any level of that, as long if the team, the core team meaning, can acknowledge that in a demo, in a you know the ticket, whatever, to say, hey, so and so helped us with this, even if it was only this much help, right? To just keep encouraging, like, we're here to help you, right? The whole point of this is to make a tool for you. Like I think contribution spikes up when you start to define them a little more broadly, and you open that kind of two-way communication of like, thank you for this comment that actually helped us go in the right direction, right? That was a contribution enough. Or thank you for all this stuff you did, it gave us, you know, all this output or whatever.
And to add to that as well, because I had a similar experience to yours, but kind of in the reverse, where we were going through a rebrand and we had lots that we were prioritizing, but we didn't have the bandwidth for some specific features. So another team actually kind of came in and helped us speed up that and contributed to the design system with our help. And I think that was really great for that team's kind of knowledge and education as well, because they
Yes.
hadn't ever done that. And I think that's really, really important to get that exposure to from other teams, because one, they're kind of out of their own product area and they're into something new. So they've got a lot of energy and fresh eyes, but it's really great for us to kind of have additional advocates and kind of people that are on our team that are then going to go back to their team and understand how it works. Like, how do you contribute? What does our code repo look like? That type of thing. And that was really, really beneficial. And in the end, it actually sped up our roadmap, because we had people that were able to just jump in, you know, kind of build some features for us. Obviously, we had to kind of create specific briefs around exactly what that was going to look like, and a bit of backwards and forwards, you know, the typical kind of process. But in the end, it was a really good success for everyone, really.
Yeah, I love that. I think that is a really important takeaway, is like to level set with those expectations. Because I've known when, you know, in previous companies, people hear that a design system is starting and they get excited and they all want to contribute, but then you can't have like your entire design system team like actively building the design system, but like identifying ways that they can contribute and still feel like they're making a meaningful impact, I think is super helpful. Um, all right, so we did talk a little bit about documentation, but I think what's interesting is that in our survey, um, we found that 71% of teams use more than one tool to document. And we asked them kind of, what did they use to document with? And this is uh, what they were allowed to select multiple choices. So this is kind of where things landed. So very big responses around design system tool itself, Storybook, zeroheight, and a couple others like Confluence and self-built solutions. Um, and I guess, I would like to hear, based on your experience, do you have any advice on how to decide what works best when you have a full range of options to document in? Charlotte, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's always a really tricky one, and I think when I think about this question, I just think about the audience. It's really like I think it's just super important to understand who are the users, like what are they going to need. Design folks are going to need something different to engineering folks, and content folks might need a tone of voice document which isn't going to necessarily live in Figma, for example. So I do always think there's always probably going to be a bit of a blend for it's quite difficult to kind of get it all in one. But what I would say, and what has worked in my experience, is kind of having almost one source of truth. So whether that is a zeroheight or a kind of a self-built solution that then has the different snippets based on the different audiences, so that you can easily come to the documentation and find what you need. And that's really what you've got to think about. It's like, okay, if I'm arriving on the site and I'm a designer, thinking about kind of personas, etc. What am I going to need to get straight away? Also thinking about the IA as well of the documentation and which of these tools can serve that best. Researching the tools, understanding the capabilities, and listening to the users, and seeing exactly what they want and whether or not that matches up with those different tools. And it like I said, it's going to be a bit of a blend, but it's kind of like what blend is going to work right for you, and just having the audience and kind of the efficiencies, because folks just want to come get what they need and then get back to their job of building stuff, right? So I think it's just really important to keep it simple. Try and have one source of truth if you can, even if it does link out to other things. I think that's always works quite well, because then folks don't get confused and say, what 5 different links have I got to go to just to get one thing, So just keeping it simple would be great.
Yeah, for sure. Taylor, do you have any thoughts?
I do. I agree with everything Charlotte was saying, but this slide makes me really sad. And the reason for that is like I think calling this thing we do a design system is a misnomer, and I think it hurts us more than it helps us. But it's too late. It's the label. But the reason I say that is like I am a strong personal advocate that documentation does not belong in the design tool. Hard stop. Design tools are for design. They are not word processors. They are not places to store long form content. They are not dynamic websites. And yes, you can make a fancy prototype and make your Figma file readable and yada, yada, yada. But every time someone accesses that, that also gives a chance for like, whoops, now you have a paid license inside your Figma tool, right? Number one. Or two, someone doesn't have access to this file because they don't have a Figma account. So you're automatically cutting off anyone that's not a designer at your company, like from the jump, depending on how your design tool instance is set up. And whether it's Sketch or XD or any of the tools out there, those are design tools, right? And this system, is not meant to only serve your designers. So from the jump, if you're using a design tool for your documentation, you're telling your engineers, your product managers, your content folks, your marketers, hey, we don't really cater to you. It's primarily for our designers, but like you can look at this too, whether you're saying that or not. And I think that the challenge here, and this is kind of I think what Charlotte was alluding to as well, is like systems and their teams have a charge of thinking of the long term, right? Not the short term. So we absolutely should meet people where they are, right? If that means writing some light documentation or just descriptions in a design tool or something, sure. But for the long form content that's meant to serve multi audiences, right? It belongs on a place that is centralized, that is agnostic of discipline and tooling access and all that stuff, whether it's a hand spun website or it's a Confluence page or a Google Doc, whatever, somewhere where like long form content is meant to be used and live. And cross linking is great, but I don't know, it feels like such an understandable but short term decision to put something as important as documentation, especially because it's usually more technical than it is related to design, in something like a design tool. It has always, at least the people that I've spoken to and like the places I've worked, has been a decision that hurt us in the long run, as opposed to thinking about the next phase, right? Even if that means training people and understanding, hey, this is where you go for this is where you go for that, and here's why. and all those sorts of things. But that's my little soapbox on it.
Yeah, no, I love it. As a as a design advocate for zero height, that makes a great case for like a third party documentation system because it is, yeah, it does, I think even if it doesn't intentionally exclude, the perception of exclusion happens at times, for sure. I think wanted to jump to, since we're on the topic of documentation, like the challenges in documenting, and maybe some of this is related to what you had just said, Taylor. But when we asked about challenges, most people said they didn't have enough resources. So resources being time or staff. What guidance can you give to teams who might be struggling with this?
I would say I think you're doing more documentation than you realize. You're just not thinking of it as documentation. I am so I have ADHD, so I have to write everything down or I forget it anyway, right? And whether that's about the work I'm doing or the progress on something I'm making, or just so I can remember what to pick up on tomorrow. And I highly, and so anytime like my teams have been on whether I was a contributor on the team or leading the team, like I've always advocated for number one, like a decision document. When we make a significant choice, we need to write it down somewhere, right? And that's the starting point of documentation, because then it evolves into, well, what do we need to tell our consumers? What do we need to tell so and so? And I'm a huge believer that design systems work is more communication work than it is a resource work, because the resources change. Whether what are you going to make a UI kit, you're going to do a repo, whatever. But the doc is from my perspective one of, if not the most important thing. So if you're working on something, if you're building something for another person, it should be part of that project, part of that work, to write down what it is that you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're doing it. It doesn't need to be robust, fancy, well curated API docs with usage guidelines, but even like a punch list of things is a start to documentation. So I think what this often, at least without seeing the actual data behind it, I think folks are taking documentation, thinking of this looming large mega effort they got to do and have all this like review and all that stuff. And sure, that could be the way you approach it, but on the same note, and I'm gonna counter my point from earlier, if you're working in Figma, right, and you're jotting things down as you go so that you remember what happened, or you're noting a token change, or you're explaining why a certain functionality works the way it does during your spec and annotation phase, during your collaboration with your engineers, like that's documentation. You're already there, right? And then a quick how to or what to use, what not to use is just another 5, 10, 15 minutes, of jotting those things down and then migrating them to wherever you're going to have your doc. So I think folks are doing more than they think they are. I think it's a scary thing because it's writing, right? And that makes people feel a little weird. But 3, start somewhere, right? Like it doesn't matter at what fidelity or how much doc you're writing. Any doc is better than no doc, right? You can always add to it over time.
Yeah, 100%. Like, I think that's the thing is, like, I encourage teams to, like, start scrappy. I think it's hard when you see, like, IBM's Carbon design and there's so much documentation, or other very mature design system sites. That didn't happen overnight. So I think, just jotting some stuff down is like you said, better than nothing. Charlotte, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I was nodding along the whole time because I totally agree with everything that Taylor was saying. And I think, especially when you're first starting, I think it's really kind of important to kind of go quite wide and shallow at first, right? And then over time, you can start to get a little bit deeper with some of those more robust documentation, etc. But at the end of the day, I think it's about the priorities of the users, trying to bring it back to what the users need right now. And I think that's just always understanding that the customer and other product teams are the driving force of why we're building what we're building. And I think when you think about what they need and prioritize that, so do they need the token documentation? Do they need something a bit more, like just understanding that and then figuring that out and just going for it at first, giving it an initial shot, and over time it will kind of start to evolve. So yeah, they're my thoughts, but totally agree with everything.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep. I want
Any
to
other
circle
thoughts?
back on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to circle back on something real quick. I think the challenge too, right, is like like Michelle, you mentioned like looking at Carbon, right, or some of the other big systems out there. I think it's really important to remember that like you at your organization are not and will never be a Carbon, right? Like let's take that and throw it out there in the first place. You're not going to be a Polaris. You're not going to be a Salesforce Lightning. You're not going to be a Morningstar. Like that works for them, right? That is their solution. They have marketing teams that work on those things. You can also make the case of some of these large enterprises who have those very robust sites, or even like Pinterest's Gestalt site, like all those things that are very outwardly facing. They are resources for the system and for the teams inside, but they're also a recruiting tool, right? So they have the time, the effort at some level to dedicate someone to look at those things and make these magical documentation, sites and have all this robust content. If your org can't do that, it doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. right? Like, let's just put that out there right now, right? I think that's number one. Number two is like remembering that, again, that those sites, that level of documentation, whatever they have is right for them. Just because it worked at big name company XYZ doesn't mean it's going to work at your org, right? I mean, that looking at smaller systems is often more innovation or more interesting information than looking at the large ones that it takes, time to turn a cruise ship and make a change, right? So I'd want to encourage folks, like, use all those sites as reference. That's great, but don't hold that as your gold standard on what you should be doing at your org, because it's not. It's a different business problem that you're trying to solve, right? And remembering to diversify which ones you're looking at. Whether you look at, for every large enterprise, look at one small business or one startup or one mid-sized company, right? Because you need that balance of what is being done on both sides to really be able to truly understand what might be right for your org or your teams or your products.
Yeah, 100%. I think at the start of, what was it, Carbon, there's probably like 68 people working on the design system, which is like the size of some product orgs entirely. So I think that does put a lot into context. Um, so wanted to also jump into something that wasn't in the report, but we have a special handout for attendees who've attended live. Um, we found some interesting evolutionary milestones of design systems. So, you know, based on the ages of people's design systems and kind of what they were doing, we were able to kind of compile like these rough milestones. So, during year one, a lot of people were creating design tokens, defining and naming them, beginning to implement some of their tokens in code. Uh, Year two, there was like goal establishment. Year three, there was like choosing a governance model seemed like a very big thing people were doing, establishing some informal processes. And I'll just quickly go over this. So, like, yeah, year four, transitioning to a hybrid governance model, achieving full documentation coverage. Year five, beginning to track metrics, because metrics are always a thing people want to talk about. And around year seven, we skipped to year six. I guess people go on a sabbatical, but a lot of times people are implementing third-party tracking tools for more advanced metrics. So I think, it seems like design systems do quite a bit of growing up between their like third and fourth birthday. Um, and I wanted to get your thoughts. So these are year three and four. From your experience, like, why do you think that might be the case? And what advice would you give to those who might be struggling to evolve their design system?
Yeah, I can
Taylor, do
I
you
can
want to?
start us off. Sure. I think the biggest thing that I like to just like level set on is like there is no set or right path on how to do this work, right? Like it's going to be different in every org, every company, every need, whatever. So like even in going through these milestones transitioned in years, like some of the stuff that was in like year 5 and 7, like figuring out your metrics and even like setting your goals, to me is like that's the first thing you do, right? Because otherwise what are you aiming at, right? But again, it depends on your org, right? If you're only a designer, right, or only an engineer starting this work on your own, then it makes sense you're going to start with like something like tokens or a UI kit or a component library to get things going, right? And then be able to say, hey, here's some validity here is working. Can we get more time, more effort, more budget, whatever, to do this next thing? And then you can start to think about goals and a mission or whatever. But depending on the problem you're solving, like for example, when I was talking about Hologram, the company I worked at prior, like for them, it was more like they understood the need. They had a resource kit already floating around. They brought in someone like me to like get it to that next stage. So they were loosey goosying things because they didn't know what the strategy should have been. So like my year one there was establishing strategy, getting goals, figuring out what we're going to do, how and where we can track the current state to inform what the evolution of the next one was before we ever did something like tokens. So I think that these milestones are helpful to think about, right? In a what might be a path kind of going forward. So long as you're, folks aren't reading this as like this is the only way to do it. It's the correct order, because it's not, right? And it's not that it's not correct. It's just that your company may be different, or your bandwidth might be different, or whatever. So each org does their own thing, and I think Charlotte, you can attest to this as well. Is like as long as you are aiming at something and have something kind of written down and chartered out, like you're already well off compared to other groups. Whether that's you start with tokens or you start with a communication model or whatever it is, if you have a plan of some kind, even if it's only a quarter at a time, or a month at a time, that's already something, and you can start to explain how that's like a systematic approach to what you're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting as well, because you can have this kind of nice evolution, and then with my experience, merging different companies, and you kind of have to rethink the whole strategy completely all over again. You've touched on a really couple of interesting points here. I think just goals are so important anyway. Just like, even if that's just tokenize, create token values that are going to work, and they're going to have like lovely tied up kind of values in the design system. Like just keeping quite focused on the value that those things are going to have, whether that's in year 4, year 5, or year 1, understanding that that is always going to evolve, and you might need to go back and reevaluate things. But also understanding the mission and the value of the design system from the get-go, I think, is a really important one. That can sometimes get people really, really hyped up as well, and excited about, this is our mission, even if it's like crazy. It's like, well, we'll try, right? We'll aim for the moon, and we'll see how we go. I know that I think it was in year 5 or year 6, it was around kind of tracking and adoption metrics. And I think it's super important to get this set up even as early as you can, even if it's just Figma Analytics, or just some kind of really scrappy tool that kind of scrapes the repos and just gives you an understanding of what people are doing. This is really, really important in my perspective, and I think it's one of the things that should really drive the success. And also, there's a couple of questions in the chat about talking to stakeholders, and kind of trying to almost like get buy-in from users, and understand what's actually happening with the actual system, and why does it exist. And if you don't have those metrics, and the design system isn't being used, then your product doesn't really exist. You know what I mean? That it's so important to understand those success metrics as early as you can. And then even like 3-4 years down the line, you can actually say, hey, look how far we've actually come. Even if that is an increase of like 10 or 15%, like it's still an increase, and it still shows that users are liking what we're building, and kind of actually implementing it and saving time. And that's ultimately the goal of the design system team. So yeah, I think that would be one that I'd probably try and bake in earlier if you could, because it's a really great one to keep your eye on, that especially as a PM, to bring it back to that value and see what's going on. And also to
Yeah.
think about as well, like adoption metrics are great, because obviously you can figure out custom code, you can figure out tokens and what people are doing. But what I also found as well is you could see what teams are not doing as well. So you might launch something, and you might have a release of a design system version 1.6 or whatever, and you're like, okay, great, we can start seeing this being picked up by X and Y team. But it's like, hang on a second, team Z is not picking this up. And we know that they have buttons used everywhere in their product experiences. Why are they not picking up that button? So I think it's a nice signal to actually say, do we need to support that team a bit more? Is there something missing? Can we kind of step in? And perhaps sometimes it's a technical restriction, which is totally cool, but in other times, they haven't always seen the announcement, or they haven't thought about it in that way. And that's a great time for design system teams to come in and be like, hey, actually, we've got this really lovely shiny button over here that is ready to go, and you've got 65 buttons in your product experience. Start using it, right? And that's the moment when you're like, okay, this is cool, this is why we do what we do. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think, I think it's also important to note that this is kind of based on kind of like what people have done or experienced. So like, by year 5, they're starting to track metrics, but like Charlotte said, like trying to do that as soon as possible would definitely set you up for success. So you don't have to wait until like, this milestone or 5 years from now. For sure. It's just, I think a lot of times in my experience, like when people are trying to hustle and put together a design system, they're just trying to get the engineered components and design components created, and they're not thinking about metrics. But for sure, definitely, if you can think about metrics sooner than later. I wanted to talk a little bit about governance uh, governance decisions. But before I jump, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, because we'll start addressing those in a little bit. But yeah, so from years 3 to 4, we notice there's a jump in governance models. So it seems like, year 3, people seem to be picking either centralized or federated. And then in year 4, hybrid governance becomes where it's both centralized and federated, becomes the popular choice. So from your perspective, I'd love to hear like why you think that might be the case. And if there are any signals that we could notice that might indicate the need for a change. Charlotte, would you like to tackle this?
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, I've kind of mostly worked on centralized teams. We have had some kind of I guess experimentation with other ways, but it didn't always work out in the best. And I think when you've got a lot more people in, it can, too many cooks type of situation. You can have too many people that have a lot of different opinions, and then actually that can have a knock-on effect kind of in the product. So I think from my perspective, I do have kind of a quite centralized perspective, because that's always been the teams that I've worked in. It's always been centralized, and then with contributions we would obviously partner with those other teams. But I don't know, I guess, after a couple of years of having a design system, folks are kind of getting quite familiar with it. Perhaps they're starting to think design system first. Perhaps the culture is changing, just starting to kind of like create those foundations. And then I think that's probably where especially some smaller businesses might start to think about, okay, how can we get other people in? How can we kind of do that product knowledge? Maybe, start with a hybrid approach, for example, and just to start to figure things out. So I think every business is so different, and everyone has such different, goals and what they're trying to achieve, different products that they're working on. So I think it's just all about finding that sweet spot and understanding, is that right? Trying it out, seeing if it works, understanding the risks associated with doing that, and kind of learning throughout that whole experience, and just finding that nice place where you're getting the adoption that you want, you're hitting the goals for the team, and you're still evolving it, right? Because you're always going to have kind of net new stuff as well as the kind of business as usual stuff. So figuring out what model works for that kind of balance between those streams of work, I think it's just my main call out.
Yeah, for sure. Taylor, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Charlotte wholeheartedly. I think that the unsaid thing there is like there has to be some core person or people or centralized ownership of something, or the initiative will die, right? Because if no one's accountable for the work or making sure that there's some sort of maintenance happening or some overall success, then like any other initiative that doesn't have someone to lead it, it starts to trail off and become a thing that just dies a slow death in the corner. So regardless of whatever overall, and the governance is such a rough word because it makes it feel like design police, and it shouldn't be that. It should be a collaboration, but that's a whole different discussion. But I think there's different ways you can approach that, even to say we're not going to pick a model. We're going to do what's right for our culture, right? And say, because the models tend to box you into a certain thing that works or doesn't work, right? And hybrid's the easiest way to say, yeah, it's going to be whatever it is as it goes. But certain things you can try, and an idea like I've been trying to get happen. We just haven't reached a point in a systems maturation scale yet to do it. But I want to advocate for, and if someone tries this, please let me know how it goes. But when you have a system at a point where like it's deployed and it's 1.0, it's stable, you've got people working on it, as some sort of healthy pipeline and process and whatever, I'm trying to get to a point where I can have every designer or engineer that onboards at the company to spend a sprint with us, right? Or spend a week with us. And that way they get built into, like, as part of their onboarding to the company, they're learning the system, they're learning how we work, they become advocates of it, they can see where its benefits are, rather than waiting till 6 to 8 months down the road when they get to their first project or are starting to own a thing, and then have to go, well, what is this other thing that I didn't know anything about, right? Oftentimes teams will present like, here's the system team, like in their onboarding slide, and move on. But I think there's so much value in that like initial collaboration. And then the last piece I'll say on this is, as Charlotte was kind of hinting at this a little bit, there's ways you can do, the council approach or something like that with different advocacy groups, but it is that cook in the kitchen thing. And I think that's where having some sort of understanding that like the system team or person, whoever that is the ultimate decision maker. They are the one responsible for the thing. So any of these guilds or advisory councils or whatever are great for input, and their opinions matter. They certainly do. But at the end of the day, they're not responsible for the work. So as long as that relationship is understood, I think it allows for that open and honest dialogue, with the understanding that a lot of that will make it into the final product or the resources that get built. But there's some decisions that those folks are not privy to, right? Because they're not charged with thinking at the system level. They're thinking at their project level because that's their job, right? So some of these things, like if folks are harping on a particular thing or another, they don't know why a decision was made. Hence the decision documentation I was talking about earlier, right? To help drive that. But getting connected with your consuming teams, whether it's a demo or having a designer jam session and an engineering jam session, to be able to show work in progress, to show upcoming decisions, and you can flavor it however you want. Here's an FYI, we're just telling you, here's something we want to noodle on you with, here's an idea we're throwing out there, whatever. Creating that connective tissue allows for any of these models to be more successful, simply because you're allowing folks to give you input in some sort of live or even async fashion regularly. Whether you take that feedback and action and make moves on it is a different story. but at least you're allowing it to come in so that you can know what folks that are using your stuff actually want out of it, right? Beyond whatever you think is right for your system.
Yeah, so true. Um, all right, so wanted to jump to a couple questions that people put in the chat, and so our first one is from Ari, who says, I'd love to hear how you've advocated for the creation of a design system in the past. I've been at a lot of startups where I've created design systems on the down low because I couldn't get the support from the broader team, even when I explained the practical and monetary value of it. Once they saw how it worked, they were bought in, but it's not sustainable to design it and get it built in a silo.
Mm. I have some thoughts. Charlotte, do you have additional information you want to add?
I'm going to add something in the chat in a second, but you go ahead and then I'll chime in after.
Yeah, Ari, you're like fighting the good fight, right? This is exactly the situation I think many orgs are in, startup or not, right? Is like, where do you begin? How do you get people to understand what it is? Like, you can read 100 articles on the value and the efficiency stuff, but like getting the pen to paper is always the hard part, and then convincing folks like, hey, this is a thing. And I think what you're explaining about like folks doing things on the down low or on a side of desk project is how a lot of these efforts organically start. The question is, when does the organization recognize that like it's unsustainable for one person to split their time across all these projects and maintaining this thing? And to be honest, I really don't have a lot for you aside from like solidarity, because it's the thing, it's the hard work, right? And at least in my experience, the only thing that's really been the core thing is if you can find one core stakeholder, one high level leader, one director plus person to really get it, right? Whether that's setting up, every 2 weeks meetings with them to give them a debrief, if that's a monthly touch point, whatever. If you can get someone in that decision making pool to understand innately what you're working on, it is far easier than trying to do it from a bottom up perspective, in the sense of like, you can get as many, advocates and designers and engineers to use the thing, but until you've got a leader going, we should put money on this, or we should allow more time, or get headcount on it, or whatever, it just never gains traction. And how the teams at Fidelity prior to my joining there, how they got some of those initial ones started is they had a company hackathon, and we're like, we're going to spend our hackathon project doing this so we can prove the value live in front of everyone. And so opportunities like that, or like maintenance sprints, or just taking a week to bang out a few things, and then getting permission to do that, and then be able to show the value of that, to have a POC of sorts, right, is always helpful, right? And it doesn't mean it's going to work, but at least to have the data and the explanation and the information, and kind of showing how that works for all, and then going, can't do more than this unless we have more time or more resources or whatever, and really sticking to that point, and kind of having to be that hard ass if you need to be. It has worked for me in the past, and for the folks that I've worked with, but it takes a certain kind of like, chutzpah to be like, well, I'm just not going to do more on this, until we get the funding, because here's why, and it's not a fun and easy conversation, but that's sometimes I think what, at least in my experience, is what's needed.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
And just to echo that as well, I think it's all about show, don't tell. And I think, when you were talking about, Taylor, the whole hackathon thing, we did something similar as well. And we kind of use the design system tokens to switch to like a dark mode, and showed how easy it was, right? And we were already getting NPS comments about, where's the dark mode? Why is it not here? That type of stuff. And when you actually show the value to the business, everyone loves it. And they're like, oh my God, this is actually crazy. Like, how easy is this? Especially with rebrands or anything that's going to have, quite a big global scale. Like at Personio, there was kind of 1,800 people in the business, and kind of 300-400 of them were in the product department. So that's a lot of people that are going to want to start to kind of get into stuff. And if you can show that, and I think I just posted a calculator as well, which is a kind of a design system calculator, because you touched on the kind of the monetary value and the cost saving. It's obviously only an approximate, but I think that has actually been quite helpful to show some stakeholders, hey, if you have 2 engineers working on this for 3 weeks, and we're going to provide it out of the box for you straight away, like, what is that cost saving associated to that in approximate? And leveraging the tracking, like I said, if you implement that early on, you can start to bring that in and bake that into a bit of a story, and start to tell the story of, hey, look, like this is actually the value that's going to have, and like this is going to allow us to scale, like, and really kind of rocket ship ourselves to outer space with the different missions that we have. And I think that is just really important. So definitely show, don't tell, and leverage some of those tools to get into the data and take the subjectivity out of it, and be like, hey, look, this
Yeah.
is what it's going to do.
Yeah, you nailed it, Charlie. I think the only way this ever works is you can do all this stuff to show the value, but you have to then somewhat at some point say this value comes at this cost. And if we don't have this cost, then we can't get this value, right? You can't keep operating side of desk or as one person doing it all the time. And then a business that doesn't understand that isn't doing business, right? Like there's always a cost analysis to all of it. It can't just be on a person or two people to do all this, kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. All right. I have another question from Amber. And Amber says, I find that non product designers have trouble navigating zero height. I've gotten feedback from creative designers and marketers that zero height is overwhelming and they struggle to understand what the design variants are or content guidelines like max word counts for specific components. Do you have any advice on how to approach this? And I think, this is a good question for anyone struggling with any sort of documentation, be it zero height or Confluence or Notion or in Figma, as some people do. So, yeah, I would love to hear some ways that Amber can think to approach things differently. Taylor, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think any tool, whether it's zeroheight, whether you use like an AppStack or Supernova or whatever, it all comes with a little bit of opinion, right? When you spin it up, and it's in an attempt to make your life, as the documenter, easier, right? But I think what we often forget as practitioners sometimes is when we're working on the system, we're kind of in the narrow mind of like we know we need to have here, we know what we need to do, we know we need to build, what we need to document, but taking that moment, even if this is like how you get things started, but going and talking to the people the system will ultimately serve in the end, or that it's currently serving, and going, hey, where are you getting these issues? Like what are you hiccuping? And it sounds like, Amber, you've done some of that digging and that research on like getting folks' pain points communicated to, and that's awesome. I think the thing that helps those folks understand that like that value is heard is like you got to put that thing in your roadmap, right? Like we're going to address the design variant problem or the content guideline problem next sprint or whatever, so that you can help them understand like you hear them, right, and you're working toward it. But the approach, right, I think is like the right amount of documentation at the right time, and that's where it gets sticky. So things like content, for example, is a great point to hit on, right? You can put all the writing guidelines and all of the content guidelines and everything on the documentation site for the system, and then overload everybody, right? Or hopefully the writing team or whoever's managing that has a place where they have that documentation, right? But you can, for example, and use the button, I think is or word count for a specific component. Let's use a button, right? On your button page, you can highlight 2 or 3 recommendations from the content guidelines and then merely link off to wherever that other thing exists, right? Your job as a documenter is also to curate your documentation to be the most useful. And if that means linking off to people, if that means having an expand collapse kind of thing that has more or whatever, right? That is part of the UX of your site, right? To make it usable and understandable and et cetera. And I hear a lot of people all the time going, oh, people don't read documentation anyway. And that's bullshit. They're reading it. And then they're going, I don't understand this, right? Or I don't know how to get through this. And that means the system team or the people building it have missed the mark, and that's okay, right? Evolve, right? You can adjust things over time. You can trim content out, move it around, right? And I think there's a significant thing to consider on like how much doc, whether you're talking about component variants, whether you're talking about API doc, usage guidelines, whatever, is the right level of information for a written document versus a video piece of content or a thing you go up in a demo or whatever, right? And it's not a one-stop shop thing like everything we've been saying, right? Whatever's right for your org and your culture is going to be right for your org and your culture. I've seen some teams do like a high level. Here's your 5 things you need to know. If you read nothing else, at least you've got that, and then you can read the rest of the doc. Like those skimmable things help make doc easier and less intimidating. If that's something you can try.
Yeah, that's really helpful. We have like 2 minutes left, and I wanted to end on a final thought from both of you. So, I think managing design systems and governance can be challenging, and it often involves change management, and maybe at times that can even feel very impossible. So, I'd love to hear what advice you have for teams who might feel fatigued or defeated. Charlotte, would you like to start?
Yeah, of course. I'll try and keep this short and sweet. Firstly, don't give up. There is always light at the end of the tunnel. It can be a long haul, and design system work is always a long haul. So just kind of understand that and know that. I would say get close to your users, understand the users of the design system, really understand them, test them, interview them, survey them all the time, really understand what's going on with them. Because then you'll start to feel connected to the problem. And I think that is really, really important, is really understand the problem at the core and try and solve that. And that will bring a bit of motivation. And also be loud about the design system, be loud, celebrate your wins, celebrate the things that you're doing, have lots of exposure to other teams. People need to know exactly who you are, and track your success. That'll be my last point.
Awesome. Thanks, Taylor.
Yeah, I think all of that stuff's right, and I think the remembering, right, that design systems work is long tail work, right? You're here to do the 1 to 3 year thing, not the deliver it in a month thing. That's the whole point of this, and I'm going to double down on what Charlotte mentioned, right? Like, you have to recognize, record, talk about each individual thing that like is a win for your team. Otherwise, you're going to lose steam. The organization's going to lose interest, right? Staying on top of that is tough, and it's hard when it feels like it takes so long to get one thing done, right? Or like this little thing doesn't really matter, but realistically, it's this big part of the whole. Like writing it down, putting it in a slide, even just celebrating for yourself or your team is super important. And that success doesn't always have to be metric driven. It could be like, we delivered a feature this sprint. That's awesome. We finally got it done, right? Like that's great. Or we made one decision really, really well in this meeting, and that's all great stuff to keep an eye on.
Great, thank you. And on that note, I would like to thank Charlotte and Taylor for joining me today for this webinar. I hope you all found it helpful. Thank you.